don't care if you want to call it a devil or a ghost or a demon. There's something in this home which has the intelligence to inflict physical and psychological harm upon this family.
Welcome to Paranormal FM, your home of the strange, unexplained, and all things that go bump in the night. It's another stormy night, so make yourself a drink and snuggle up under a warm blanket as we prepare to explore the Smurl Family Haunting, the true story behind the Conjuring last rites. Before we begin, please note that this episode contains reports of sexual violence, so viewer discretion is advised. It was 1973, and America was still reeling from the devastation wrought by Hurricane Agnes the year before, with over 128 deaths, the equivalent of $27 billion in damages, and over 300,000 people displaced by flooding, which in some places was as high as 38 feet. This, at the time, was the worst natural disaster in the history of the United States. But sometimes destruction can create an opportunity for new beginnings, and the Smurl family were hoping for just that, after having their home and livelihoods swept away by the storms. And in October that year, Jack and Janet Smurl, along with their two daughters, Dawn and Heather, moved into a West Pittston home in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, with Jack's parents John and Mary Smurl. Built in 1896, it was an old house, the oldest on the street. For the first 18 months, the family settled into a routine of redecorating and remodeling the home, with Jack, Janet, and their daughters living on one side of the duplex, and Jack's parents on the other. The haunting started as a series of incidents that, although inconvenient and occasionally strange, never gave the family any reason to suspect that anything supernatural was happening. The first incident occurred on the 10th of January, 1974. Janet had brought home a new rug as a belated New Year's gift for the family. Jack helped her carry it into the front room and smiled to himself as he watched Janet excitedly roll it out. It was the first new item they'd purchased since moving home, and although it was expensive, they felt they deserved a reward for the hard work they put into refurbishing their new home. As Janet stood up to admire the rug, a look of disgust spread across her face. Jack followed her gaze and saw a huge reddish stain right in the middle of the rug. To him, it looked like blood. He touched the stain, and to his amazement, it was wet and left a greasy residue on his fingers. They cleaned the stain out of the rug, but a few days later it returned. This time, no matter how much they cleaned the rug, the stain stubbornly remained. It was as if the rug itself was somehow bleeding. Soon items around the home, such as Jack's medical bracelet or items of the girl's clothing, started to go missing. And while this could be explained by absent-mindedness, what was harder to explain was the disappearance of tools Jack was using during renovations. One time, while replacing a floorboard, Jack put down his hammer, but when he reached for it again, it was gone. It then reappeared the next day, this time covered in a thick layer of dust. This became a frequent occurrence with other tools, screwdrivers and paintbrushes disappeared, and then turned up in completely different places, such as the attic or basement. Stains started appearing on the walls of the home. There was one dark mark on one of the bedroom walls that no matter how many times they painted over it, it continued to seep through. One morning, Jack overheard Janet angrily muttering to herself in their newly fitted bathroom. When he went to investigate, he saw the sink and bathtub were covered in deep scratches, with some parts so badly damaged that chunks of porcelain had been torn off. It looked like a large wild animal had clawed at them. But strangely, they didn't hear anything during the night. That same week, pipes around the home started to inexplicably leak. Jack tried to fix the issue, but when the leaks continued, they employed the services of a professional plumber. But the pipes continued to leak despite being resoldered. The first indication of something more sinister was when the fire started. Those of you familiar with the channel will recall similar accounts of items spontaneously combusting, as in the case of the Sally House haunting. Jack was watching TV one evening when it suddenly started smoking and then erupted into flames. This could have been written off as a one-off occurrence or faulty wiring, but soon other items around the home started to catch fire, even when unplugged. So far, the Smurl family had only experienced minor occurrences, but on the 15th of February 1975, something changed, and whatever resided in the Smurl family home initiated the first stage of its nefarious plan for the family. It had just passed 11 p.m., and the peace and quiet of the Smurl home was broken by the shrill sound of a young girl's screams. Before either Jack or Janet could investigate, their bedroom door burst open, and their terrified 9-year-old daughter Dawn came running in. When they finally calmed her down, Dawn tearfully told them that she had seen shadowy people with no faces hovering above her bed. They reassured their daughter that this was just a nightmare, but this soon became a nightly occurrence, and a short time later, both children began to complain about the sound of invisible birds fluttering in their rooms at night. They thought perhaps, due to being in an unfamiliar home, the girls were imagining things. But one evening, when Jack and Janet were relaxing in the front room, they heard the unmistakable sound of someone running a bath upstairs. Janet rushed upstairs, assuming her children were playing in the bathroom. But when she got there, the bath was empty, and her daughters were sound asleep. A short time later, the toilets started to flush on their own, but whenever Jack investigated, everything was normal. Foul odours of rot and decomposing meat started to permeate the home. The smells came and went without warning. One evening, Jack had an experience that all but confirmed a presence in their home. It was 1 a.m. and he was in bed, floating around the edges of sleep, but a strange, persistent tapping kept pulling him back. He groggily opened his eyes, and as wakefulness returned, he realized that the tapping was footsteps coming from above. This immediately struck him as odd. The only room above him was the attic. He reasoned that perhaps an animal had found its way in, but as he listened, he realized that the footsteps were undeniably human. His heart now pounding in his chest, he quietly picked up a flashlight to investigate and made his way up the stairs leading to the attic. With each step he took, he heard the footsteps getting louder. He reached a shaky hand to the door and paused. The footsteps had stopped, and in their place was a slow, rhythmic creaking noise. He gently placed his hand on the door handle, took a deep breath, and with the flashlight raised over his head, burst in. But the attic was empty. He took a few calming breaths, then realized that he could still hear that strange, rhythmic creaking. He pointed his flashlight in the direction of the noise, and it illuminated an old rocking chair. It was rocking back and forth as if someone was sat in it. The chair suddenly stopped rocking, and Jack once more heard footsteps, but now they were running in his direction. Jack dropped the flashlight and ran out of the attic, locking the door behind him. This was the first time Jack had an encounter with something he couldn't explain. And as the events continued to escalate, neighbours of the Smurls started to notice the strangeness taking place in the house. This included odd noises from the home when the family were asleep, as well as hearing screams and seeing flashing lights in the house while no one was home. This became so persistent that one of the neighbours, convinced that somebody must be in, called the home to ask what was going on. But they became even more confused when the mocking voice of a young girl they didn't recognise answered the phone. When they asked who they were talking to, the young girl's voice transformed into the terrifying cackle of an old woman. Then the call disconnected. The neighbour tried calling back, but no one answered. The stage was set for a haunting that was about to spiral into a living nightmare for the Smurl family. Over the next 2 years, the Smurls had come to accept that their home was haunted. But when Janet gave birth to twins, Karen and Shannon, in 1977, the new life in the home breathed terrifying new life into the phenomena the Smurls were experiencing. The continued paranormal activity was taking a toll on the family, most notably Jack's mother, Mary Smurl, who suffered a heart attack and was hospitalized for 2 weeks. During this time, the activity continued to escalate. Kitchen drawers slammed open and shut during the day. Pots, pans, and utensils were strewn across the floor of the kitchen, and radio static blared at full volume in the middle of the night. This became such a frequent occurrence that the family unplugged their radios at night, but this didn't stop them coming to life when everyone was in bed. Cold spots were felt around the house, particularly in the master bedroom, and the family started to hear disembodied voices. Sometimes they heard whispers, other times they heard screaming or shouting. At first, the voices were indistinguishable, but over time the voices began to mimic those of the family insulting each other. It's clear that the purpose of this was to cause division within the family. One of the most notable instances of this occurred a year after Mary's heart attack. Mary and John Smurl were sat in their front room, taking advantage of an unusually uneventful evening, when they were interrupted by the sound of their son, Jack, yelling from the neighbouring duplex. At first, they thought that maybe he'd hurt himself doing some late night repairs. But as the yelling continued, they realised he was screaming with a rage and hate they'd never heard in his voice before. They were debating going round to check on him, but what came next made their decision for them. They heard a huge crash, like something had been thrown against the wall. And that was when the screaming started. Panicked, terrified screams, Janet's screams, the children's screams. The banging intensified, and as it did, so too did the screams and desperate pleas for Jack to stop. John ran into the neighbouring duplex, but when he walked in, he found Jack, Janet and the children happily gathered in the living room, watching TV. Over time, the haunting progressed from strange noises, smells, and changes in temperature felt by everyone, to targeting specific members of the Smurl family. Jack was reading in bed when he sensed he was being watched. He put down his book and looked around, but with the exception of Janet sleeping next to him, he was alone. He continued reading, and just as he was getting lost in the story, he felt Janet's hand gently caress him. He smiled and turned to Janet, but she was asleep. That was when he felt the hand again, this time rubbing his shoulder. He screamed and leapt out of bed, but Janet had somehow been sleeping the entire time. So far, Janet hadn't been a target of the haunting, but this would all change one morning while doing laundry in the basement. She was busy folding clothes when she heard Mary, her mother-in-law, calling her from the shadows. She was about to call back when she remembered that Mary was out of town. Not only that, but she was the only one in the house. She released an involuntary shudder. Then the voice came again. When she heard it a third time, she realized that the voice held the eerie quality of someone attempting to imitate her mother-in-law, but not quite pulling it off. She tried to ignore it and focus on finishing the laundry. That was when the voice called out again, this time in a mocking, sinister voice, now making no attempt to conceal its true nature. Janet backed away and asked what it wanted. She once more heard her name, but this time it was so close that she could feel the icy cold breath of something dead whispering in her ear. Janet screamed and ran out the basement, but whatever was down there was far from finished with Janet Smurl. A few days later, while Janet was folding clothes, she felt a sudden chill. It grew so cold that she could now see the steam from her breath. She looked up and saw an indistinct, black, humanoid mist floating just feet away from her. Janet got the distinct impression that it was looking at her. She could only stare back, trying to process what she was seeing. Then the figure glided past her and into the living room. She followed it just in time to see it pass through the wall and into the neighbouring duplex of Mary and John Smurl. Janet ran next door and burst in. She'd barely entered when she saw Mary in her favourite colonial-style rocking chair. But something was wrong. She was sat, frozen in place, her face a deathly pale, and her once kindly eyes now stared absently into the distance. Before Janet could say anything, Mary leaned forward, her frail hands shaking uncontrollably. Then she told Janet she had seen a black thing move through the house and into the living room before disappearing. Following the encounter with the strange black mist, the haunting appeared to have subsided. But this was just the eye of the storm. In 1985, the haunting unleashed an unprecedented level of terror on the Smurl family, the accounts of which rank among the most horrifying and disturbing ever recorded. And it seems that there was one event which was the catalyst for what came next. It was the morning of Heather's confirmation into the Catholic Church. The house was buzzing with excitement, and the haunting was beginning to feel like a distant memory. Janet was working on her daughter's dress when she heard a strange, metallic shaking from above. Janet looked up just in time to see the large ceiling light come crashing down towards them. She screamed for the girls to get out the way. Janet and Heather were lucky, but Shannon was struck on the shoulder and left with a nasty cut that needed stitches. When Jack inspected where the light had been, he realized this wasn't just a poorly fitted light that came loose. It had been violently torn from its fittings. Whatever had been hiding in their home seemed to have been fully awakened by Heather's confirmation. The family were determined not to be chased out, but the presence in their home was now stronger than ever. The first sign that the haunting was becoming violent was one night when Jack awoke with a distinct sensation of floating. It was only when he came to his senses that he realized he was suspended 2 foot above the bed. He started to panic and thrashed around at the unseen force holding him in the air. It was then he was hurled back onto the bed. He wasn't hurt, but the message was clear. He was about to become a plaything to the evil in his house. Soon Janet was also targeted. One night after she and Jack had finished making love, something unseen grabbed Janet's leg, attempting to pull her off the bed. Somehow Janet was able to stop herself being thrown to the floor, and as if frustrated by her resistance, loud bangs from inside the walls filled the home. It wasn't long until the haunting targeted other members of the family. It started with Simon, the family's German shepherd, who was picked up and thrown across the living room in full view of the family. Fortunately, he wasn't hurt, but this was just the start of a number of strange occurrences surrounding the family dog. During the night, the family would be awoken by the sound of the dog howling, barking, or fighting with something. But every time they checked on him, he was always sleeping peacefully in his bed. Strangest of all was how the dog appeared to be transported about the house. There were several occasions when Simon was seen playing in one room, but when called, appeared right next to them, like he'd been there the entire time. Apart from leaving him a little confused, Simon never appeared harmed by these transportations. It's often reported that animals can sense and see things humans can't. Could this be why Simon was targeted as the haunting started to escalate? One night, Jack and Janet were awoken by a loud thud from the staircase. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped from the top of the stairs. Then they heard Shannon's cries echoing in the darkness. They ran out their room and found Shannon crying at the bottom of the stairs. Unhurt, but clearly terrified, she told them she didn't know how she got there. Then, a few days later, their eldest daughter, Dawn, was pushed down the stairs, spraining her ankle. The family, unsure of where to turn, felt they had no choice but to endure the haunting. But once their children became targeted, they knew they had to find someone who could help them. It was around this time Janet attended one of Ed and Lorraine Warren's lectures at a local college after hearing about them from a professor. When the lecture was over, she approached them and was relieved when they agreed to help. And on January the 17th, 1986, Ed and Lorraine Warren met the Smurl family for the first time. They arrived with a psychic, and after introducing themselves, they sat in the kitchen and asked the Smurl family if they'd ever practiced Satanism, dabbled in the occult, or used Ouija boards. The Smurls told them that they hadn't. The Warrens explained that the next step was to conduct a walkthrough of the house to see if they could detect what was responsible for what the Smurls were experiencing. Lorraine quickly picked up on 3 spirits, but as she continued, she found herself drawn to the closet in the master bedroom. She jumped as she heard a voice from behind her ask, "Are we going to look inside?" It was the psychic that had accompanied them to visit the Smurl family. Lorraine realized that the closet had brought on a trance-like state, and she'd been staring at it for a number of minutes. Lorraine moved quickly to the closet door and flung it open. As soon as she did, she was hit with a wave of intense evil. Then she whispered the word that had been lodged in her throat ever since she first entered the house. Demon. They gathered back around the kitchen table, and Lorraine delicately explained that she'd sensed 4 spirits in the home. Jack and Janet looked at each other nervously. Lorraine described one of the spirits as an elderly, senile woman who was more confused than malicious. The second was a violently insane younger woman who may want to harm the family. And the third was a male, capable of violence, and that a violent event from his past had trapped him in the home. Janet's face went white as she remembered hearing about a man called John Lutz who murdered his wife while under the influence of demonic forces 90 years earlier. It seemed that even in death, he would never be free. Lorraine paused, then carefully explained that there was a 4th spirit, a demon, that wanted to create chaos and destroy the family. And in addition to using the other 3 spirits, it would take on many forms to achieve its nefarious goal. Ed Warren warns that all the signs indicated that they were already at the 3rd demonic stage, oppression, meaning that next was the 4th and final stage, full possession, and eventually death. The Warrens wasted no time in starting their investigation, and that night they saw firsthand the forces the Smurl family had been subjected to. Janet looked at Jack and placed a nervous hand in his. An uneasy silence hung heavy in the air. She felt like she was in the middle of a spiritual standoff between the Warrens and the presence that Janet knew was intently observing them from the shadows. It was Ed Warren who made the first move. as he began leading the group in prayer, and almost as soon as he started, the entity made its displeasure known. Small items shook on the tables, and the door handles rattled. Then, as an ice-cold breeze filled the room, a black mass emerged from the shadows. Janet stifled a scream and cast a terrifying glance at Jack, who gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. But she could see in his eyes that he was just as scared as she was. Just then she heard the sound of plaster tearing, and in the gloom she saw one of the large mirrors moving back and forth, as if something was trying to pull it from the wall. Janet could no longer hold back the scream that had been building in her throat, and felt her whole body shake as her lungs expelled an intense, primal expression of fear and anger, an unadulterated and visceral representation of every moment of torture her family had suffered since moving into that house. As she screamed, the TV on their dresser started to emit an eerie, silvery white glow. Janet stared at the TV and saw three figures nearing the screen. She took an involuntary step back, and in response, the figures moved even closer. It was then she realized they were not only watching, but also reacting to her. Ed Warren took a container of holy water and began sprinkling it around the room as he prayed. Janet moved closer to Jack and gripped his hand in hers. As Ed continued to pray, the glow from the TV slowly dimmed, and as peace once more returned to the home, Janet felt relief wash over her. The group conducted a prayer of thanks, but the Warrens were now in no doubt of the validity of the Smurls' claims. This would mark the start of a 6-month investigation, during which Ed and Lorraine Warren reportedly captured hours of unexplained audio recordings and photographs. But for the Smurls, the terror had only just begun. The Warrens advised the Smurls to ask their church for help, but aside from blessing the house, the priest was unwilling to do anything more without the approval from the diocese. And the diocese weren't prepared to sanction an exorcism without clear evidence of a demonic infestation. By now the Warrens were celebrities in their own rights, due to the recent investigation into the Amityville horror. But their celebrity brought controversy, and the church, keen to avoid being embroiled in a media circus, were hesitant to validate claims of demonic infestation without verification. Lorraine Warren even tried to meet with the Smurls' local priest, who told her, in no uncertain terms, that he didn't have time for her. All this left the Smurls feeling like their own church had abandoned them when they needed them most. A few days after the Warrens' visit, Jack was jolted awake by the sound of something slapping flesh and Janet's pained shrieks. He quickly turned to his wife and saw a red mark forming on her cheek. "It just hit me," Janet said. She barely finished talking when there was another slap and another. Janet's face reddened more and more as invisible hands continued to attack her. The sound of banging reverberated through the house. Then the TV came to life, bathing the couple in the same silvery white glow from when the Warrens first visited the home. The activity calmed down by the early hours of the morning, but the message was clear. Getting the Warrens involved was a very bad idea. Jack patrolled the house with Simon to make sure everyone was safe. But the evil in their home was about to make sure the Smurls knew what a huge mistake they had made. Janet lay in the bath, closed her eyes, and smiled as the warm water embraced her, melting away the stresses of the day. It was the first time in weeks she'd allowed herself to relax. It wouldn't last long. She was suddenly overcome with an intense feeling of being watched. She sat up and froze, suddenly uncomfortably aware of just how naked and vulnerable she was. Then came the whistling, lurid and threatening. She screamed out, and Jack came running into the bathroom to find Janet terrified and covering herself up in the corner. Over the next week, the bathroom became a battleground. In addition to seeing strange headless figures in the corner of the bathroom and hearing suggestive moans when she was alone, a particularly terrifying incident took place a short time later. It was 2 a.m. and Janet had awoken with an unusually intense thirst. The house was in complete darkness except for the bathroom, the light of which they agreed would stay on due to the recent events. Janet picked up her glass and walked into the bathroom and froze. Stood in front of the towel cabinet was a large, hunched, hooded black form. It turned its head slowly towards her, and despite there being only darkness where its face should be, she felt it staring intensely at her. Janet stared back, entranced and terrified in equal measure. Then the figure moved towards her. She ran down the hall and woke Jack. But when he went to investigate, the figure was gone. For some reason, Janet had become a focus of activity in the house, and things were only about to get worse. The following night, when laying in bed, Janet felt a hand moving up her thigh. She turned to Jack and saw that his hands were folded. She looked down and screamed as a shadowy hand moved slowly up her leg. Jack saw it too, and leapt out of bed and sprayed holy water at the hand, forcing it to retreat. Unfortunately, this wasn't the last time Janet was molested. At times Janet was laying right next to Jack, screaming for him to help, but he wouldn't wake. And others, when she found herself completely paralyzed and at the mercy of her attacker. A few nights later, Janet was visited by the apparition of an elderly woman. She had her hair in a bun and wore a navy blue cardigan and sat at a ghostly colonial-style table. The woman said nothing. She just smiled at Janet, pleasantly, almost reassuringly. And while a little confused, for the first time, Janet wasn't afraid of what she was seeing. Around this time, the Warrens were in daily contact with the Smurls and regularly visiting the home. During one of the visits, Ed Warren did an experiment in which he played religious music through a speaker as part of a ritual of religious provocation, designed to force the demon to reveal themselves. If it was a response Ed was looking for, he certainly got it. He was choked and almost passed out, and then began to suffer severe flu-like symptoms. But ultimately, the plan to entice the demon to reveal itself was unsuccessful. Things were getting worse for the family, with nearly everyone suffering some form of physical attack at the hands of the entity. It was becoming an almost daily occurrence, but what came next was one of the darkest and most disturbing accounts of demonic activity ever recorded. The first indication of what was to come was the following night. He was awakened by the sound of women talking. He initially thought it was his wife trying to wake him, or maybe his daughters. But when he looked up, he saw two women stood in the corner of the room. One looked to be in her early 40s, the other to be around 20. They were old-fashioned clothing, but strangest of all was the silvery white glow the two women cast. It reminded Jack of the glow of the TV during Ed Warren's religious provocation ritual. But almost as soon as he saw the two women, they disappeared. The following night, the women came back, but this time, the two were talking to each other while looking over to Jack. It was clear that they were talking about him. He couldn't make out what was being said, but the harsh tones of their voices held an undeniable threat that made him uneasy. He instinctively tried to move up the bed and away from the women, but found he couldn't move. That was when the younger one looked straight at Jack and curled her lips back in a mocking, impossibly exaggerated smile. His unease transformed into pure terror. He tried to cry out to wake Janet, but no noise came out. The young woman's smile grew into a threatening sneer, and Jack could tell by her eyes she was enjoying his terror. She stared at him hungrily, almost as if she was feasting on his fear. Then the two women stepped back into the closet and dissolved into the darkness. Jack was left with a distinct feeling that the women were sizing him up, and 3 nights later he found out exactly what was planned for him. Jack was sleeping in bed when he once more experienced the sensation of falling, but this time it was more violent, like he'd been thrown off a cliff. He woke with a start and looked around, panic still thumping in his chest. Then a familiar feeling of fear and unease overcame him, and that's when he saw it. The hideously pale form of a naked old woman emerged from the shadows and crept slowly towards the beds. As she neared him, he realized this wasn't a woman. Its skin was covered in patches of serpentine scales, and its body was riddled with open sores oozing pus that dripped down its back in rivers of green mucus. He tried to move, but was paralyzed. And as it crawled onto the bed, he knew what was coming. It climbed on top and stared into him from deep red eyes. Its long, white, straggly head swayed as it moved back and forth on top of him. He tried to look away, but found himself unable to break its gaze. Jack felt it tense and jerk on top of him, and felt a new level of repulsion as a mocking smile spread slowly across its face, revealing a mouth filled with sharp, vampiric teeth protruding from dark green gums. With each jerk, its smile grew wider. His disgust intensified as he realized it was enjoying itself. Once it finished with him, it disappeared, The only sign it was ever there was a pungent, residual sticky substance that now covered his body. As soon as he found himself able to move, he ran to the shower, where he scrubbed himself until his skin was raw and brushed his teeth until his gums bled. He immediately called Ed Warren, who told him he'd had an encounter with a succubus. While genderless, those that target men are known as a succubus, and those that target women are known as an incubus. Janet was sleeping downstairs during Jack's ordeal, but when Jack woke her to tell her what happened, she immediately broke down. While the two sat down over breakfast, discussing what to do next, Dawn entered the kitchen. Looking visibly distressed, she told them about a terrifyingly vivid nightmare she had about Jack and the reptilian old woman. After this new and disturbing development, Janet once again asked for help, but with the church unwilling to assist, the Warrens once more intervened. They brought in Father Robert McKenna to perform an exorcism on the house. Around this time, although the activity became less intense, people in the house kept falling ill, including Ed Warren, who was too unwell to attend the exorcism. But the most notable sickness was that of the Smurl's daughter, Karen, who nearly died following the onset of a sudden and undiagnosed infection. The exorcism would ultimately be unsuccessful, and the activity continued a short time later, with their daughter Dawn having a disturbing encounter in the shower, where she felt something unseen grab her arms. But fortunately, she was able to push past whatever it was and run to the safety of her parents. Whenever the family tried to escape the horror, such as going on camping trips, they would continue to be plagued by strange events, such as the manifestations of a black mist, or the ghost of a young girl that watched them from the tree line. Even at work, Jack wasn't safe, with his colleagues reporting hearing the same knocks and bangs that Jack experienced while at home. The family realized that even if they moved home, the demonic presence that had latched onto them would follow them wherever they went. It was a short time after the camping trip, and Janet was sleeping off a headache on the sofa when she felt a gentle tickling on her thigh, like that of a spider crawling up her leg. She instinctively brushed it away, then felt it again, this time on her belly. Then it quickly moved towards her neck. Before she could react, invisible hands wrapped tightly around her throat. She clawed at them desperately, but as their grip tightened, darkness slowly filled her vision. Then she recalled a religious visualization technique Ed Warren had taught her, and focused on picturing Jesus Christ in her mind. The hands loosened their grip, but only slightly. Then she heard Simon growling at her assailants. The dog made a futile attempt to attack whatever it was strangling her, but each time he leapt at her invisible attacker, he passed harmlessly through the air. As Janet continued her visualization, the hands loosened enough for her to take a desperate intake of breath, and with one final push, she summoned all her strength to scream out Jesus' name. The hands released their grip. The presence was gone, and Janet sank back onto the sofa, sobbing tears of fear and relief. The following day, Father McKenna performed a second exorcism. But within months, the paranormal activity returned to its previous levels, with Mary Smurl regularly seeing a black figure, Jack being thrown against a wall, and nearly every member of the Smurl family either being scratched or bitten by an unseen entity. With their local church refusing to help, the Smurls made the fateful decision to go public. They appeared on several talk shows, and their story was reported in local newspapers. But the publicity they received backfired massively. Not only did they have people camping outside the house, hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal activity, but strangers turned up in the middle of the night and peered through the windows of the home. There was even an incident where a brick was thrown through a window by a group of people who thought the Smurls were making the whole thing up. One positive from the exposure was the appearance of psychic Betty Ann Moore, who visited the house and corroborated what Lorraine had sensed during her initial walkthrough. She too identified 3 spirits: a senile old woman, an insane young girl, and finally, the spirit of a middle-aged man who beat his wife to death in that very house after becoming paranoid she was having an affair. Janet was once more reminded of John Lutz. Finally, she identified an incredibly powerful demonic entity that infested not only every room, but the very fabric of the house. As if to punish the family for drawing attention to the home, the entity found new ways to terrorize the family, and Jack once more found himself the focus of its attention. He'd only been sleeping for half an hour when he was awoken by the sound of snorting and scratching coming from the foot of the bed. What he saw was something out of a nightmare. Stood at the foot of the bed was a huge creature on 2 legs. Its wide shoulders and furry head were silhouetted by the moonlight. It took a step forward, and that was when Jack noticed its eyes shining the same deep red as that of the succubus. But this was no succubus. This was something else. Some horrific hybrid of pig and man. Jack watched in revulsion as its wet black snout twitched and sniffed at the air. Slobber ran down its fur-covered face as it grunted and slavered. Then Jack thought he saw what resembled something like a smile or a smirk spread across its face. It slowly raised a clawed hand and pointed it at Jack, then slashed menacingly at the air. For the first time, Jack felt in genuine fear for his life. It took another step forward, then lunged, and that was when the screaming started. The screams woke Janet, and she saw Jack's trembling, sweat-covered body curled up on the floor. She helped him back into bed, and the two spent the rest of the night praying for morning. With the activity showing no signs of stopping, the Warrens once more intervened and proposed holding a mass exorcism with several priests and parishioners from a local church. Father McKenna returned a few days later to perform a 3rd exorcism, and it seems that the combined forces had successfully expelled the demon from the home. That was until shortly before Christmas, when Jack was once more reminded that salvation wouldn't be so easy. He just turned off the TV in the living room and as it turned off, he saw a black shadow standing motionless before him. It raised a gloved hand from under its dark cloak and beckoned at Jack. Something stirred deep within him, a painful murmuration that burned at his insides. That was when he realized it was reaching for his very soul. It was attempting to complete the final stage of its plan, full possession. Jack gripped his rosary beads and started praying over and over. Finally, the figure slowly retreated and faded away into the wall. He decided not to tell his family about what happened, hoping that this was finally the end of the haunting. But a few nights later, the banging and putrid smells returned. The haunting had started all over again. The Smurl family moved back to Wilkes Barre a short time later, and while the activity followed them, they got a Vatican-sanctioned exorcism on their new home, which finally brought an end to one of the most disturbing and terrifying hauntings ever recorded. But as well as being one of the most disturbing and terrifying, it is also one of the most controversial. Firstly, the decision to go public backfired massively, and not just due to the reported increase of demonic activity in the home, but also due to the public's reaction to the case. Rumours quickly circulated that the Smurls were having financial difficulties, and had exaggerated or even made up the whole thing for money. While it could be argued that the Smurls only went public as a genuine plea for help, the credibility of their claims wasn't helped by the Warrens' involvement, and the rumours of there being a financial motive seemed to be vindicated when a short time later the Smurls signed a book and movie deal based on their experiences in the house. The Warrens did little to help the growing skepticism. They repeatedly told the press that they had video and audio evidence of the haunting, but continually changed their story when asked to present it. They told one journalist they had given the tapes to a TV company that they couldn't remember the name of, and another that the tapes were in possession of the church, even though the church denied receiving anything from the Warrens. One of the most prominent skeptics was Paul Kurtz, who at the time of the Smurl haunting was the chairman of the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. He immediately became suspicious when his team visited the Smurl home, only for Ed Warren and Jack Smurl to meet them at the door and deny them entry. Kurtz later discovered that the Smurls had complained to officials about foul smells arising from poorly constructed sewer pipes prior to the haunting, and he theorized that their young daughter Dawn may have been behind the reported bangs. He concluded that there was no reason to believe that any of the phenomena the Smurls were experiencing was paranormal in nature, the implication being that the whole thing was a hoax. The theory of a hoax was further supported when it was discovered that a priest sent by the church for 2 nights had experienced nothing unusual. And while John Lutz did murder his wife, this took place several blocks away from the Smurl home. Another theory, which doesn't rely on the Smurl family making the whole thing up, is that the family was suffering from a mass delusion known as folie à famille, or madness of the family. This depends on the delusion originating with a dominant family member, such as a parent, which then goes on to infect the rest of the family. And Jack Smurl appears to fit the role perfectly. In 1983, 9 years after the haunting started, Jack Smurl underwent an operation to treat hydrocephalus, which is a buildup of fluid on the brain, a common side effect of which being delusions and hallucinations. Could it be that the haunting was nothing more than a side effect of an underlying pathology which then spread to the rest of the family? It's interesting to note that the most disturbing and terrifying accounts of the haunting all revolved around Jack Smurl, events which no one else was ever witness to. Other observers have been less dismissive of the haunting, pointing out that if it was a hoax, then the neighbours who reported the strange lights and noises from their home must have been in on it too. But, as is so often the case with stories like these, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. That's all from Paranormal FM. Thank you for sharing your evening with me. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this one. Thanks again, and be sure to join me next time.